Thanks very much indeed, Tricia. It's not often the Minister is my warm-up act, but I'm very pleased to sort of follow his overview of what we're going to be discussing sort of for the rest of this morning. So I've been asked here to give the HSE perspective. I'm the Health and Safety Offshore Regulator, and what I want to do is... Here we go. What I seek to do here today is to very much complement what Charles Hendry has just said to you. I want to provide a bit more detail because we're here for the whole of the morning, and I think it's very useful that we actually have some sort of bedrock of facts that we can sort of play with, and which other presenters can do that. I want to remind you that actually there's still all to play for. There's still a lot of negotiations, both at the European Council and European Parliament, so I want to put that into context as well. I want to give you a little bit of reassurance. It's not all doom and gloom. There's some sort of good things from a health and safety perspective here, but I also want to highlight that there's a lot of onus on us all. And it's not just the regulators, not just the politicians, but certainly the industry, that we've all got a lot of influencing which we need to do if we want to get this, these proposals to where we in the UK would like them to be. So that's what I want to achieve by the end of my sort of half hour. And sort of the agenda for my session is just a little quick review of where we are, because I think that will be a good basis for the rest of the morning. I want to talk a little bit about the proposals themselves, in case some of you are not completely familiar with what's there. I think it's useful for us to work out, right, what's similar. You know, what are we familiar with about the proposals, and which parts of the proposals are in fact different and ones which we would need to sort of change. I want to talk about the concerns and challenges which we have. Charles Hendry mentioned the key ones, but let's sort of unpack those a little bit more, and just a few conclusions at the end. So that's how I want to sort of plan this particular session. Inevitably, at almost every offshore event, Piper Alpha has to be respected and seen, because we need to reflect in the UK that although these proposals have come out of Macondo, which happened thousands of miles away on a different continent sort of a couple of years ago, we had our own sort of Macondo moment nearly 25 years ago, 24 years ago this year, Piper Alpha. Tragedy of 167 people died there. So this whole topic is something which is very deep within the psyche, certainly of this city and within the particular industry in the UK. We did a hell of a lot of moving, changing, of shaping following Piper Alpha. We had the Cullen inquiry, which identified the causes of the fire, but more important for today was the changes which the Cullen inquiry led to in the form of our legislative regime for offshore safety and the way we actually regulate. Because after the Cullen inquiry, there's a recommendation for the transfer of responsibility of the safety regulation to the Independent Health and Safety Executive, which I represent. So there's a bit of distance, clear blue water, between the sponsoring department and the Department of Energy. So that happened nearly 20 years ago. Review of legislation and changing the old pre-Piper legislation, which was very prescriptive, pretty narrow, to the goal-setting legislation, which we're pretty familiar with now in the UK, Health and Safety at Work Act, etc., and also setting up a safety case regime. So we've been working with those goal-setting regulations, safety case regimes, for well over 2 decades now, and we're pretty familiar with that. And we feel that those changes were made in response to the challenges from Piper Alpha. But I think it's important for us to recognise that we haven't sort of fossilised since Piper Alpha. From our legislative regime, we had a review in 2005, and we actually changed our regime in 2005 to take the lessons that we'd had in the previous 15 years. So I'd like to think that the regime that we have, it has been kept fresh, has learnt the lessons over the years, and is pretty fit for purpose. So that's where we are in the UK. We need to recognise that the effect that Macondo had, just over 2 years ago, a real tragedy for the 11 workers killed. But I think the changes compared to Piper Alpha was the intense concern about the environmental impact. Like the pollution had nearly sort of 5 million barrels of oil, and you can all remember, the pictures that we all saw from the Gulf of Mexico of the oil pelicans and the concerns which people had about the effect on the Gulf of Mexico. And I think what that did to us, on the other side of the pond, as it were, it did actually raise the awareness considerably of members of the public, members of Parliament, the politicians, the press, of the potential consequences of a similar oil spill in the relatively enclosed environment of the North Sea, the very enclosed environment of the Mediterranean, or the Black Sea. So it certainly did cause that sort of step change in people's concerns. I think it also caused an increase in the perception of the of the financial and economic consequences. I think if you're going to talk about luck with Macondo, at least there was BP, an extremely substantial company, who was able to sort of ride out that particular incident, was able to manage it, and is still afloat. And if we look in the UK quite recently, we've had somebody of the size of Total who've been able to sort of manage the Elgin leak. But, there is concern within the public, concern within the politicians of what about the smaller companies? Are those smaller companies resilient, both in their management, manpower to manage these incidents, and also in their economic and financial backing as well to manage the consequences of those incidents? So bringing all that together from Macondo, I think it's you can understand the desire within the European Union, within the European Commission, for a review of where we are in Europe and, if necessary, changes that we are in Europe. And I think what we had very soon after Macondo was an extremely bullish reaction from the European Commission, and especially from the European Commissioner Oettinger. Some of you will remember with real concern the proposals, well, let's have a deep water a moratorium in all European waters. That was a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Let's have a control of controllers. Let's not trust the national regulators. Let's have a Brussels-centric inspecting body to police the offshore industry throughout Europe. And let's have tighter regulation, and that always is, I'm afraid, one of the responses from incidents is let's write new legislation, even though actually it's not the legislation which is the issues, it's the compliance and the regulatory system. But we had a very bullish response from the European Commission to start off with. So what happened was that in October 2010, so about 6 months after Macondo, we had the initial proposals and initial thoughts from the European Commission, and you've got the title up on the screen. And later on, early 2001, the European Commission consulted on proposals, which was on a range of legislative changes. Some were making actually no change whatsoever to the European regime. Others were making it extremely regulated from the centre, extremely prescriptive. And there was a range of a spectrum of proposals there. And after that consultation exercise, we had the first formal proposals, which came out last October. And a bit of a surprise for us all was that the proposals were in the form of a regulation and not a directive. And just to sort of explain in relatively simple terms, if there is a directive, it's a general direction from the European Commission for member states to change their own internal legislation up to a common benchmark. But the actual way in which that implementation is done is left to member states. So there's a fair amount of flexibility there. And also directives are extremely common. We're very familiar with those directives, not only in the health and safety field or in the environmental field, but financial management, etc. So Normally, it's the directive approach which is the norm. On this occasion, the Commission said we'll have a regulation, and that is a direct acting regulation, so that there is no need for us to implement, because actually that European regulation becomes the law of the land throughout Europe as soon as that is enacted. And the problems that we have with that is there is no flexibility for taking local legislative regimes into account. The language is set, it's European language, not sort of a member state's language. And as I said, it's a direct acting, it comes into effect immediately. And another consequence is that if member states have existing legislation which overlaps with such a regulation, they have to repeal and get rid of their own domestic legislation, so that there is only the European regulation in place. So a big change there. So those draft regulations were published in October 2011. What then happened is there's been a series of negotiations in the European Council, and there's been an energy working group, which my colleagues in DEC and some of my colleagues in HSE have been involved with Foreign Commonwealth Office, as these proposals get debated with the member states, word by word, line by line. And therefore, for the last sort of 6 months under the presidency of Denmark, we now have a revised proposal, which was published in April. And that draft regulation will now be subject to further negotiations over the next months, firstly under the presidency of Cyprus. Now, what's been the UK initial responses? What's been the regulatory responses? Well, I think there's a real cry that we feel that our regime is pretty robust. And it's not just us as the regulator saying that, but it's our Parliament. We've had a select committee inquiry looking at that. We've had independent reviews. The Minister mentioned the Professor Maitland's reviews. And feeling from yourselves as the industry that we feel that our legislation is robust and has stood the test of time. And in a way, it's a sort of flattery for us in the UK that the European Commission are using the UK's regime as very much a benchmark for others. They've been very honest about that, about how they see the main issues are perhaps some of the Mediterranean states, the Black Sea states, who are not quite so mature in their regime, not quite so mature in their regulatory systems, and they want to use ourselves as well as others in the North Sea as a benchmark. And we're pleased also that they're taking a goal-setting approach rather than a prescriptive approach. So certainly from a health and safety as a regulator, we feel passionately that it's those people who create the risks have to manage the risks. It's not a matter of transferring the risk to the regulator. So a goal-setting approach is quite a challenging approach for you as the industry, but it's the right approach for a major hazard environment. So pleased that the Commission have gone down that route. And particularly pleased that they're going down a safety case route whereby the regulator has to assess and accept the safety cases. So it's quite an intrusive role by the regulator. So that's some of the initial responses to the proposals. In principle, were pretty good. I thought I'd just go through some of the other parts of the proposals which you will be familiar with and pleased with. There's a large number of notifications in the regulation coming from the Commission, of which you'll be very familiar with. There's notifications to the regulators on design, at the design stage, which very much mirrors what we have already in the UK for design notifications in the safety case. Combined operations notifications, relocation of installations and notifications. When you're doing intrusive well operations, notifications to regulators. So the whole body there is very much mirrored on what we already have in the UK. So that will be familiar. They're no longer calling the safety cases that title. They're calling them major hazard reports. But very great familiarity with our approach. And compared to perhaps other member states, they have chosen the UK approach, whereby there is quite an intrusive role of the regulator to assess and accept safety cases before operations actually start. Other countries perhaps don't have that role, and I think the European Commission have realised that we are very much at the benchmark there. So that's a familiarisation for you as well. Interesting, they are taking sort of the third-party verification approach, which we have had in the UK for some considerable time, which we feel is quite central, whereby you as operators have to identify your safety critical elements and have those performance verified by independent third parties. The Commission are saying, let's make that a European-wide benchmark and regime. Similarly, about well operations, if you're doing well operations, you need to be able to keep the regulator informed so the regulator knows what's going on and can take action. So that proposal, which is what we already have in the UK, is being spread out around the UK. So some of the proposals you'll be familiar with. There are dangers, though. As always, the devil's in the detail, and there's a lot of negotiations and words get changed. So we certainly need to be alert that we can at least keep those areas which we would like to feel are already in the bag, but there is a danger there, so we need to keep alert that those areas which are familiar within the proposals, we do keep. There are other differences which will add value. And I think personally one of the big issues is an appreciation that it's very difficult to tell where safety integrity finishes and environmental protection starts. For those of you who are familiar with the sort of the bow tie model of protection, myself and the Health and Safety Executive, we're doing the safety integrity, so it's the left-hand side of the bow tie, doing all the prevention, and a little bit on the right-hand side where we're protecting lives during an incident. But my colleagues in DEC are very much responsible for the right-hand side of the bow tie, which is looking at the consequences and making sure the environment is protected. Well, I think to be fair, we do have separate systems, separate legislation. And what the proposals are suggesting is that we bring that much closer together. And I think that is something which is sensible and I think will be good for you as the industry. There's also a demand for greater involvement of the regulators. So in fact, there's much more coordination between the environmental regulators and the safety regulators to perform a competent authority. We're working a lot with DEC, and we're working very considerably together with memorandums of understanding, and the proposals actually are talking about even ratcheting that up. So I think that's a supportive proposal. Other differences are a more common data reporting format, greater transparency for the industry and also for the regulators. I think one of the issues which came out of Macondo is lack of trust from politicians, lack of trust by the press and also the public in our industry and also ourselves as regulators for that industry. And I think the way in which we can get over that is by having greater transparency of what we do. And one of the vehicles will be via these proposals, whereby the regulators need to be more transparent, the industry needs to be more transparent. And that includes sharing findings of major incident investigations. Another difference is to make sure that there is greater cooperation between the regulators in the European Union. At the moment, we have good cooperation with our North Sea regulators, but not so much with our Mediterranean colleagues or our Black Sea colleagues as well. And therefore, there's a demand for there to be a greater sharing of expertise and greater bringing together. And there is going to be the creation of a European Union Offshore Authorities Group, of which I've been asked to be one of the co-chair of that, which will act as a forum for making sure we get a bit more consistency in regulatory approaches, and we can also act to help some of the less mature regulatory systems to bring them up to our sort of level. It would be remiss of me not to mention some of the environmental and liability issues which are also within the proposals. These are responsibilities of my colleagues in DEC, but you have here a slide which talks about some of the proposals, certainly looking at licensing authorities, making sure they take into account the technical and financial basis of operators, looking at good public participation in the licensing process, and extending the European legislation on environmental liability to cover all offshore activities in European waters. So it's not only a safety a bit of legislation, the significant bits of the legislation on environment and liability issues. However, everything in the garden is certainly not rosy. And I certainly share the points, the key points which the Minister made, that one of our red line issues reflects the need for a directive rather than a regulation. And that is a negotiating point that we've said time and time again, and we always come up to there. We've certainly prepared a case study for the European Commission to show the consequences of having a regulation rather than a directive. We certainly raise this at every issue of the working group on energy with our colleagues from DEC, and we've also, along with DEC as well, briefed the UK MEPs and also some of the rapporteurs in the European Parliament committees. So we are very much making sure that those within the European parliamentary machinery are well aware of the UK concerns. We've met the European Commission to explain our case study about the consequences for the UK of a regulation rather than a directive. And I think we feel that we actually, and this is a frustrating thing, we feel we've won the arguments, but we still are having a lot of difficulty in actually getting that message through. But I think there is a chink of change there. I think we're beginning to get our arguments through. And it's quite positive that the European Commission have now commissioned an independent survey to look at the differences between the impact assessments which the European Commission have made and of which Oil and Gas UK and the UK have made and which Norway have made, because there are differences in how we perceive the impact of the legislation compared to how the European Commission perceive the impact of the legislation. And it's important that they have asked the UK's Health and Safety Laboratory to act as an independent review to look at all the impact assessments produced to actually come up with an objective and a factual review of exactly what the impact of the regulation would be across Europe. So I think the analysis of that underlying evidence will help in the continuing discussion. I also think to be positive that ministers and officials are being effective in our negotiations in Europe. Minister talked about his discussions with Commissioner Oettinger, and I think that is that's very positive. We still have a way to go, but I think that shows the power of in continuing the negotiations, continuing the dialogue. And we also have a lot of support with other member states and with other regulators for the directive route rather than the regulation route. It's regrettable there are a number of countries, though, who don't support a directive route. And as you can see from the slide, they're not countries with big offshore industries. Our concerns continue, and I think there is also danger when you negotiate legislation that it's the devil's in the detail, and we still have a lot of negotiation to come. So it's really important, our real concern is that we get clarity of the requirements in whatever shape or form the legislation is. We certainly are looking to minimise disruption and the resources for implementation. And the Minister sort of mentioned some of the resources which we could anticipate if we went down a regulation route rather than a directive. So that continues to be our concern, continues to be our negotiating point. And we particularly want to make sure we do have a level playing field of implementation. We don't want to be in a situation whereby the UK does it by the book but nobody else does. Minister also talked about these delegated powers, and in a way this is not a health and safety or an environmental issue. This is a government policy it's government policy to minimise the delegation of powers to the European Commission. There is a treaty which does allow the delegated powers, and we have to make sure that those delegated powers are for non-essential issues, so minor changes to legislation rather than fundamental changes. So there's a lot of negotiations to make sure that some of the delegated powers which the proposals talk about at the moment, which talk about there's a considerable number of annexes in the proposals which are going to be within the delegated powers, we need to whittle those down to make sure they really are non-essential issues rather than key parts of our legislative regime. Other concerns are the priorities for this offshore European Union Offshore Authorities Group. I think the UK view, it should be a group to make sure that there is guidance on implementation of whatever the legislation is going to be, implementation on making sure we have a common baseline of regulation, and not a body for writing guidance for the industry. So I think the priorities of that group has got to be something which we need to keep concerns about. I think there are initial concerns about what about workforce involvement. I think always in the UK we do talk about the crucial issue of workforce involvement. There's nothing about that in these proposals. I think we are reasonably content on that because there is a separate directive this time, Directive 92/91, which does talk about workforce involvement, and there's also the framework directive for workers in industry anyway within the European Union. So actually we feel the workforce involvement is going to be covered by other directives. But having said that, we still have many challenges remaining. And I wouldn't want to underestimate the challenges which we've got about changing proposals from a regulation to a directive. It's very rare for such a significant change to be made. But I think I'd like to be positive. I feel that we're beginning to get traction. We're beginning to make our case quite firmly with the politicians in Brussels, with the other trade associations, with the trade unions, and with the members of the European Parliament. So, don't give up hope. There's still a long way to go. We also have the challenges of transitional arrangements, whichever shape or form the legislation has, and our challenge is to make the changes, as minimal as we can for us, so that we don't take our eye off the ball, so we all can concentrate on the front line rather than concentrating on just writing regulations and writing guidance. I think there's challenges for the European Parliament. The European Parliament has a very strong green body, and therefore we can anticipate demands and discussions in the European Parliament for yet more environmental protection, more lack of trust of regulators, etc. So it shows that that's a slightly bit of an unknown body, European Parliament, and therefore that's an area where we need to direct our own influencing areas to as well. And I think the last challenge is that I'm just worried that people may get a little bit sort of fed up with the pace of change. Deepwater Horizon was 2 years ago. And I think there will be a demand for us to implement any changes as quickly as possible. As Minister said, if it was a directive, we would be able to marshal our thoughts pretty quickly because I think we could be able to implement that much quicker than we would via a all-embracing regulation. So my last slide and my last message, and this is a message to all of us in the room here, to us as regulators, to politicians, to officials, but particularly to you as industry, is I think influencing of others is a key. And I think that's a positive thing which you can all take away. I think we must continue to influence the European Parliament. As I said, a little bit of an unknown. They are going to be making their views known. And I'm aware from my discussions with MEPs that perhaps a lot of them don't know much about your particular industry. We need a lot of education, a lot of influencing. And we need to continue our political influencing with the UK, and Charles Hendry is very much on board on that. I'd like to think that we can be crisp with our arguments that we have. I think we need to be strong on the facts. We need to avoid the overstating. We need to avoid overplaying, because sometimes if we overplay the arguments, that can be interpreted as being unwilling to change, and that's not what we're about. I see we here in the UK, we're very much for continuous improvement. So we need to be subtle in our influencing. We need to be very aware of the dangers of appearing to be complacent. We're not complacent. What we're saying is that we have built up our legislation over 20 years. We certainly don't want to jeopardise that. What we want to do is to add things on top which will improve. So I hope that's given you a bit of a background and some pointers for the rest of the discussion over the rest of the morning. Thanks very much indeed.